Hello, world, and welcome to ARM TV. ARM TV live streams are regular live episodes that cover the most interesting, disruptive technology trends facing developers in the near future. Our speakers are notable visionaries and innovators who delve into the latest technologies shaping the future of computing, their impact, and how to make them work for you. My name is Robert Wolf. Looking at myself on the camera here, and I'll be your host today. And in this episode, we are thrilled to be joined by Dr. Rumman Chowdhury, whose passion lies in the intersection of artificial intelligence and humanity. She is a pioneer in the field of applied algorithmic ethics, creating cutting edge socio-technical solutions for ethical, explainable, and transparent AI. She is also currently the CEO and co founder of a tech nonprofit named Humane Intelligence and a responsible AI fellow at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard University. She has been honored to be one of the BBC's 100 Women, Forbes 5 Who Are Shaping AI, and Time Magazine's 100 AI Leaders. Now, we hope you all enjoy the next hour with us and our guest, as we will be doing many more streams like this in the coming months. So, please do keep your eye on the ARM Developer Hub events page, where you'll be able to register for future ARM TV episodes or live streams like this one. Following this live stream, we'll be making the video available on demand through the ARM Software Developers YouTube channel. Please check it out. Feel free to share this with your fellow developers, and don't forget to subscribe. Now, as a reminder, if you are on the ARM Developer the ARM Developer Discord server, you can go and talk about this event. We're there waiting for your questions. Please take a moment to head on over there. And if you have any questions, we'll be sure to bring those to, you're going to scroll right there. We'll be sure to bring those to our guest. All right. So I think without further ado, let's bring our guest in, Dr. Rumman Chowdhury, joining us from Washington, D.C. Hello, Rumman. How are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. Trying to go through all of the stuff, making sure that everyone knows what's going on in the episode. I fumble a little bit. There's a lot going on, but it's so
There
nice to
is a
have you
lot
here.
happening.
I know. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
What a background. I mean, that's amazing. You have a lot of experience here. I mean, this presentation is bound to be pretty amazing. Could you kind of maybe share a little bit, give us a little teaser about what we're about to go into?
Yeah, so you gave a bit of background about myself. I'm a data scientist and a social scientist. I've been working in the field of AI or, data science or whatever it was called back when I first started. I was one of the first wave of data scientists in 2012, and I've always viewed this as a socio-technical field, right? It is a field in which we actually understand patterns of human behavior using data. And I've actually seen it kind of warp, and now human beings are viewed as data sources rather than the recipients of the things we are building. So in 2017, I was hired by Accenture to build their practice in responsible AI. And yeah, it's been a wild ride ever since. But yet today I work outside of industry. I run a nonprofit and also have a for profit, and we do something called red teaming. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the talk.
Very nice. Yeah, I like how you say, we're as humans being used as data sources. I think, back in the day, and I'm not too long ago, data seemed to flow outwards to the human. And now the data is being created at the human and flowing inwards and then being used. Is that kind of like what you were referring to, or
Yeah, or just like, what are we building the technology for? And I
ah,
feel like it's reached this fever pitch of like we're building technology for technology's sake. And the entire purpose has always been we are trying to build technology to build better things for human beings.
mm,
But I think that message sometimes gets lost a little bit because we get very excited about the idea of artificial intelligence. Also, talk a little bit in our chat. During my presentation about this phrase I coined, moral outsourcing, how we anthropomorphize AI systems. So there are many ways in which AI can be used for good, but we have to be intentional.
I like that. I like that. And I'm pretty sure you're going to cover all of this inside your presentation and your talk coming up right now. So are you ready to just dive into that?
I'm ready to dive into it.
Let's do it. All right. So, Rumman, we'll be in the green room. If you need anything, just call for us. And I look forward to seeing this. It's going to be awesome. Thank you.
Perfect.
All right.
Thanks.
See you in a bit.
Hey everyone, I'm so glad to be talking to you all today. For those of you who woke up early on Pacific time zones, I appreciate you. And those of you who are there a little bit later in the day, I appreciate you as well. So my name is Dr. Rumman Chowdhury, and as Robert mentioned, I'm the CEO and co-founder of a nonprofit called Humane Intelligence, and I'm also a responsible AI fellow at the Harvard Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. So I gave a little bit of background about myself while we were chatting, but I'm a data scientist and a quantitative social scientist. And one of the things I've been saying lately is I get to be a social scientist again because so much of what we talk about in artificial intelligence has come back to be to realize that actually what we are talking about are understanding the needs, wants, and the issues of humanity and regular people. So I've been building responsible AI solutions since 2017. I started at Accenture, which is a large tech consulting firm. For those of you who are unfamiliar, I had a startup called Parity, which was an algorithmic auditing startup, which was acquired by Twitter. And I worked at Twitter until last November. I led a team known as the Machine Learning Ethics, Transparency, and Accountability team. So I was an engineering director on that team. Today, I'm outside of industry for the first time in my time, really in the field of responsible AI. I work on algorithmic auditing. I work on policy. It's one of the reasons I'm in DC this fall. And I work on the concept of algorithmic accountability. How do we design accountability mechanisms into the algorithm systems that we are building? So we're now in this world of generative AI. And what I want to talk about today is what's new and what's not new in responsible AI. So what's amazing is that all of these people a lot of people who've never thought about artificial intelligence as something that would impact their lives, even though it has been, but haven't thought about it directly, are now in this world of generative AI, which is great. And the most interesting thing about what happened last fall, so ChatGPT was released last November. One of the most interesting things that happened is that what we had was a revolution in accessibility of these AI systems. So for a lot of people, this was their first foray into generative AI, but actually generative AI has been around for a while, right? ChatGPT was GPT 3.5. We've had previous systems. People talk about stable diffusion. We've had Dolly and Deep Dream. So what changed? So yes, so the newer wave of technologies are a lot more impressive seeming. They perform a lot better than previous versions, and they're meeting and increasingly surpassing benchmarks and establishing new state of the art. But the big revolution actually was in the accessibility and the design of how you interact with these systems. So, for example, the fact that ChatGPT looks literally like a messaging window changes something in our minds. It makes it a little bit less scary. You're not looking at code. For people who don't code, code can look very intimidating or daunting. And even a user interface that, frankly, maybe a more technologically minded person would find very simple or easy or not intimidating to somebody who doesn't ever program can be intimidating. So now we're in a world in which everybody from a young child to a hairdresser, to somebody making their own website thinks about using generative AI to help them in whatever tasks they have. And this builds on an increasing revolution in what's called no code, right? So now we're seeing an increasing shift towards systems that are more easy to generate without having to learn to program. And actually, it's very reminiscent of HTML and website programming, right? So once upon a time, like when I was in high school many moons ago, and some people maybe on this call were not even born yet, you used to have to use a programming language called HTML to make your websites. And you'd have to understand the hex numbers for colors, and you'd have to understand how to embed a picture or how to use certain fonts. And it was actually very fun if you enjoyed that kind of thing. Today, really, very few people have to code HTML. There are many template websites that exist that allow you to naturally drag and drop photos, write text the way you would in a document. And that's been quite a revolution in online accessibility, the number of people who have a presence online that looks streamlined and professional. But then what's interesting is that the development of AI and the evangelism of AI is actually now about the culture of good product development practices. And that's what I want to talk a little bit about today. So, what has not changed? I talked a bit about what's new, what's old. So, somehow we've rewound time to 2017 and we're having the same conversations all over again. When I mentioned that I was hired to build Accenture's global responsible AI practice, these conversations about gender bias, race bias, demographic, geographic, cultural biases are the same conversations we had in 2017. At that time, we were really pushing the narrative away from this idea of Terminator and HAL and paperclip maximized to say, hey, actually, the real world use cases that we are seeing, the things to worry about are not an AI that's going to take over the world. It is actually the fact that we are implementing poorly designed AI systems that are reinforcing and amplifying the existing harmful biases in the world today. So these two articles are actually from 2022, but I can show you identical headlines from 2017. So what's changed? So what's one big thing that has changed is we are no longer in the early days of artificial intelligence. So back 6 years ago, 7 years ago, machine learning and AI was really not a broad adoption in most industries. It really existed mostly in the major tech companies, the FANGs of the world. And let's say companies like McDonald's or Pepsi were thinking about building AI teams. So they had data science teams they'd sort of invested in. Data science was almost more like analytics, essentially. Um, so, but what's interesting is we're not in that world anymore. And again, it's interesting because the latest revolution has been a revolution of accessibility, not just the technology. And we're also smarter about the impacts of AI systems, and we have a little bit more idea of how regulation should look, how standards should look. Again, back when this field was first becoming mainstream, I was one of the first people who actually had a job in building responsible AI versus the strong history of research we had had on the impact of AI systems. I was one of the first people sort of tasked with building solutions for companies to use. But now we're smarter about that as well. We're no longer doing this for the first time. Folks on this call may be familiar with the NIST AI risk management framework. NIST is the National Institutes for Standards and Technology in the United States. They've released a risk management framework that talks about how companies can think about the impacts of AI systems. In the EU, we have the Digital Services Act, which has passed, which looks at very large online platforms. What's fascinating about how the DSA is written is that it actually specifically looks at the harms on a broader scale on society rather than sort of thinking through financial harms or consumer harms. It's specifically jumping all the way ahead to say we need to think about violations of fundamental human rights, impact on democracy and democratic processes, mental health and well being. I mean, these are, in a sense, almost abstract concepts, but creating a regulation around how to test for that is critically important. The EU AI Act has really consumed a lot of media conversation around regulating AI systems, and also even locally in the US, we have laws that are passing in different states and cities. So the city of New York has an algorithmic hiring law. Colorado just passed a law about insurance and the use of artificial intelligence in insurance matters. So one thing that's not changed, I talk about what's new, I talk about what's changed, talk about what's not changed. So much of technology is built on a culture of collaboration, community, open source, and open access. I think for folks who are new to the field of AI, machine learning, data science, big data, et cetera, it's actually a wild take that most of our culture, most of the stuff we have built is actually built on the fact that we just put what we built out there in the world and we want people to use it. So my first entrance into the open source community was the early 2000s working with the R community. And I'm a social scientist by background, as I mentioned. The R programming language is pretty dominant in those fields, but it was quite a revolution to be handed a software for free and also be able to go online to these message boards and to these online spaces like GitHub repos where people just shared what they learned and they help people with their questions. It's actually a very beautiful thing. So the reason why we're moving so aggressive, we're moving so quickly, there's so much development happening, is because we freely share what we build. And like that culture and keeping that sense of openness, collaboration, community while building responsibly is what I view as the challenge for folks like myself. Like our job is not to design regulation that shuts down collaboration, community, and open source and open access. Our goal, in my mind, is to create standards, guidelines, culture, norms, and regulations that actually support that openness. And I'm going to talk a bit about that today. What does it mean to be independent of companies and government, but be working on building accountability structures? That's what I'm spending my time doing every day. So, why is culture important? I had talked in the very beginning about this concept of moral outsourcing. So, it's a TEDx talk I gave, I believe, in 2018, and it's interesting because it's something that manifests in the language and the practice of building artificial intelligence. So, moral outsourcing is how we talk about this technology in a way that we've never talked about other technology before. So we say things like in some of those headlines that I showed, we'll say things like AI is not immune to racism, or it will say AI will replace teachers, or AI diagnoses cancer better than a doctor. And the construct of that sentence is fascinating to me as a social scientist because it puts artificial intelligence, a technology, and it essentially makes it into a proper noun. It makes it into a thing with a name and it anthropomorphizes it. In other words, it makes it human. It in that construct of the sentence, we have put the AI in a space where it is taking action on the verb. AI diagnoses cancer. And in doing so, the subconscious message we are giving is that this artificial intelligence system has free will. It has proactively decided it wants to figure out how to cure cancer, therefore it's gone and like built a model. None of that is true. Human beings used an AI system to diagnose cancer, but we drop human beings from that narrative altogether. And it's problematic for two reasons. So, number one, and this is the moral outsourcing aspect of it, it absolves the developers of any sort of responsibility for the technology that's built, right? So, moral outsourcing would mean that if you're saying AI diagnoses cancer and then it is somehow broken or discriminating against a particular subgroup, well, the developer isn't in that sentence. They're not the people who did it. The AI did it. And in doing so, again, we're removing responsibility in a way that we frankly should not be. We should not outsource the morality of our decisions as developers to a technology. The technology is simply responsive to how we have built it, what we have built it to do, and more. The second thing that's problematic about that sentence, and this is what's fueling a lot of the fear hype around artificial intelligence, because just as there's there's hype around the optimism of AI, the potential of AI, there is also hype around the fears. And it is that sentence AI will replace teachers or AI will replace lawyers, that a regular person reads and thinks, wow, I have no role in this. I have no agency over what's going to happen. And this technology that I do not understand is going to come and take my job away from me. Because again, we've anthropomorphized it, we've humanized it. And again, untrue. So culture is important because we have to build accountability into practice, how we talk about the technology, how we build the technology, but also what are the practices that happen as we train people in our own fields, right? So I just said that this field has been built on openness, open source sharing, and collaboration. But that doesn't mean that we are without norms, that we're without culture. We are. How do we formalize them? How do we think about them? So one thing that's been very trendy is this idea of a Hippocratic oath for data scientists, right? And one of the reasons it doesn't work on its own is when doctors say a Hippocratic oath, it's not a spell. They're not casting a spell and making themselves ethical and responsible and responsive to patients. What they're doing is they're verbalizing what their training has been for many years. And there's many institutional structures and ways in which they're indoctrinated into a culture of medicine. Even though doctors go off and they build their own practices or they join another practice, they bring that culture and they evangelize that culture that they have been taught in the institutions that they are in. So if we want to build a good culture around responsible use, we need to think through our communities that exist and how we incentivize or enforce good behavior. So where does that leave us? So the toys have changed, but the rules of the game have not, right? So we have these fancy new AI systems, but actually they're just like the old systems. Algorithmic bias manifests in the identical ways. And what we really need is an ecosystem to address responsible AI. So I'm going to start with the middle tab, right? So industry actually has been spending a lot of money building out responsible AI. I've built and led some of those teams. I've advised Fortune 500 company as they built their responsible AI teams, right? So not Not to say it's perfect, not they definitely have not solved all the problems, but we've seen the most investment to date by industry. Now we're seeing government. So government has been slowly building, and now it's reaching this momentum where we have standards, guidelines, benchmarks, laws, responsible AI built into different government arms. So it's very heartening to see that engagement, and we're also seeing lawmakers having these conversations as well. And then that leaves independent third parties. So there's always been a strong civil society that talked about the impact of technology. It has largely been qualitative in nature, so lots of reports, policy papers, etc. How can we invest in the work that I do, which is on algorithmic accountability via technical access and external review? In other words, building algorithmic auditing and assessment. So let's talk a little bit about the government ecosystem. I think most of the folks on this call are pretty familiar with what industry is doing. Well, what's government doing? What is the government building? So first is that regulation is here. So that slide used to read regulation is coming, but actually regulation is here. Um, so in particular, the regulation is opening up new possibilities for data science auditing and also reimagining AI risk detection to be more inclusive. So I mentioned the Digital Services Act. So what's really fascinating about the DSA is twofold. One is Article 34, which talks about algorithmic auditing. And auditing is defined in probably a different term and a different way in which we've seen before. So auditing here is defined as I mentioned, impact on things like fundamental human rights, impact on things like mental health and well being, impact on democracy. So we're actually seeing some of that play out right now with Thierry Breton and the folks who lead the Digital Services Act in the EU, taking action against mis and disinformation related to ongoing conflicts in Israel and Palestine. So we're seeing we're seeing how auditors and assessors are enabled to take action against harmful outcomes that they're seeing. What's interesting is that also opens up the field of third party algorithmic auditing. It enables an independent community of people to be hired by governments and companies to assess and understand these AI models. So it's fascinating because AI risk detection generally lived within the purview of companies. And the narrative and argument always has been like, well, we can't just open up our models to anybody because it's in violation of data privacy, security, and intellectual property, which, by the way, is actually true. So what this law enables is a institutional pathway by which external trusted parties get access for the purposes of creating AI that's beneficial to humanity, but their background is not their paychecks are not paid by industry, right? So there is a role for industry to be doing this work, but there also is room and a need for independent third parties that are acting on behalf of the public to be part of this narrative as well. So, what's an algorithmic audit and who is an auditor? And the thing is, nobody knows. It's something that I'm working on right now. We've seen a lot of laws, as I mentioned, pass as it relates to auditing, but what we haven't defined is what an audit exactly is. And while there are laws that would require auditor access, I think there are a lot of people trying to develop training and standards. What we lack is actually a community consensus that's driven from the bottom up. So remember, again, back to that slide in the beginning where I said this field is built on collaboration, community, and open access. So it does not actually make sense for some group to come in and from the top down say, well, I'm just going to decide what an algorithmic audit is. You got to come and take my training and get my stamp of certification. That's just not how this field has worked. So, what I'm focusing on is upskilling and training, addressing institutional gaps, and actually investing in the kind of technology that would be needed to balance accountability and transparency, right? So, how do we provide external people access? How do we create the kind of community environment where we're all developing and agreeing upon what auditing, assessment, and standards look like? So, how can independent parties be engaged? So, when I was at Twitter in 2021, my team launched the first algorithmic bias bounty. So, some of you may remember in October of 2020, there was a controversy around bias in our image cropping algorithm. So, the image cropping algorithm would auto crop your photos. It was based on something called a saliency algorithm. So, it would track people's eye movement. The original data tracked people's eye movements and where they looked on photos. This model was trained on it, and it turns out human beings are biased. And the interesting thing is we did a full assessment based on the kinds of issues that came up around gender bias and skin tone bias, racial bias, and we actually opened up this code for public scrutiny as well. So we recognize that there's no way that our team could identify every single problem that would happen, and we wanted the community to be involved as well. And it was a wild success. We received, dozens of responses, very technical in nature, ranging from community-based data science all the way to people who designed their own StyleGAN style filter to demonstrate harms and biases. But then where would that go next? So last fall, I established the first nonprofit dedicated to algorithmic bias bounties, and we actually held a public event open to anybody and sort of unaffiliated from any company to teach machine learning experts and AI experts on how to create less biased AI models. And specifically, we address the problem of image bias. So it's something I call structured public feedback. It is a way to harness the opinions and perspectives of external parties in order to directly inform improvements in how models are developed. Well, with the revolution of generative AI, what that enabled was accessibility to a wider range of people, as I said, right? So last June, I had a congressional testimony where I actually talked about building and protecting independent communities. So these were kind of the four recommendations I gave. The first one was support for AI model access to enable independent research and audit. Second is investment in and legal protections for independent red teaming and ethical hacking. Third is development of a tech oversight body. And the fourth is participation for the US in AI global governance. So it's critically important that governments stay engaged at all levels. But I'm going to focus a bit on the what I was talking about with independent communities. So, with the revolution of generative AI and the ease of access to AI systems, we're actually able to design no code bias bounty. So, our previous bounty programs and red teaming programs have actually required you to have some degree of knowledge of coding because, in order to directly provide feedback on the issues of a model, you would have to create a way for you to program and interact with the model. Well, generative AI essentially solved that for us. So last August, me and some of my colleagues designed the largest ever generative AI red teaming exercise. So it was 2,200 people, eight large language models, and we also was sponsored by and worked with the U.S. government. This was sponsored by the Office of Science, Technology, and Policy. And the goal was to actually expand the notion of what artificial intelligence access means and what red teaming means. So traditionally, um, red teaming comes from concepts in the military. So in the military, a red team would be an external group that would try to infiltrate your whatever your protections were, right? Similarly, that was drawn into cybersecurity and InfoSec. Red teaming is actually a very well known practice, commonly used, where external parties are hired to try to hack into and break into your systems. And red teaming is usually a last mile approach. So it's the red teaming is what you do before your product is ready to go to market. Red teaming does not replace good governance. It does not replace good practices and development. What it is actually a test of the security systems you have built. So red teaming was brought into AI security, which is very fascinating because in artificial intelligence, now that we have general purpose models, what it means to have subject matter expertise is no longer you have a fancy degree in something, right? You don't need to have a PhD in cybersecurity or biology, physics, or chemistry in order to test these systems for potential harms. Now, what we're talking about when we talk about harms are actually embedded biases. And then what becomes a quote legitimate viewpoint or a subject matter expert is literally somebody who has had that lived experience. So you can see in the quote below from this article where I talk about how we need a lot of people with a wide range of lived experience, subject matter expertise, and backgrounds because we are trying to find problems that would not be the issues that would be represented in the demographic makeup of the traditional AI teams and development teams and security teams within tech, right? So again, this goes back to the work my team did at Twitter. We recognized that we looked at two factors of bias. We looked at race and we looked at gender. We know that image bias can take many different forms. How can we engage with the public to give us that feedback? So this is like the evolution of that project. Now, what we're saying is everybody should have a say in how AI systems are built. Everybody should have a say in raising issues about AI systems. What we want to do is create this structured feedback loop. We want people to provide feedback. We want companies to absorb that feedback, change their models, and then actually publish a report or tell the public exactly what they did and how they fixed it. So we're forging new territory, as I said. So there's a couple of things that we're doing that's critically important. One is I've talked about these institutional pathways that exist in other industries and other fields. We don't have them in AI. We don't have a way for the public to actually engage with companies in a meaningful way to highlight and raise their concerns. Today, the way anybody is heard when they have issues with models that are being built or they're experiencing bias due to AI systems is you have to go viral on social media. Maybe a journalist will pick it up. Maybe the media will rally behind you, civil society, and now there's immense pressure on companies. But then the conversation is very volatile, it's very confused. Companies are on the defensive. It's actually not a productive environment to solve problems. The second thing we're doing, at least I'm doing, is I'm learning a lot from my colleagues who work in cybersecurity and thinking about how AI security, the notion of secure systems, is expanding to think through responsible and ethical use. The third important thing we're doing is I keep mentioning this feedback loop, and the loop is very important, and this ecosystem is very important, right? So independent third parties should collaborate with, but not be beholden to corporations and government. We need to be embedded in the decision making systems and be part of the conversation. But how can we do that and retain our independence? That is the critical part of this entire conversation. The other thing we did is we created pathways for underrepresented communities. So we received funding from the Knight Foundation and Seed AI, one of the partners, brought in 250 community college students from 18 different states. So we've collected a massive amount of data. This was, as I mentioned, this was in August, about 2 months ago. And we're doing research into at-scale harms with every single major large language model company. So I run this meeting every 2 weeks where we actually are going through this data. We're aligning on a shared narrative, and we're going to talk about what harms were identified, and then later how they were actually fixed and addressed. So what happens after is what we're trying to do is set the precedence for a space for third-party auditors and ethical hackers to be free of institutional affiliations in order to participate and create a more inclusive space. So what we're testing is, as I mentioned, we're expanding the concept of red teaming, not just in terms of who's allowed to be in the room, but also what we are testing. So in traditional security, AI security world, prompt injections are what people looked at. So prompt injection is when you get the model to violate its terms of service. So this is what is like a traditional hack. There should be a safeguard in place. It is illegal to do thing X, but someone has managed to break through your safeguards and make thing X happen. So all of these models are trained to, for example, not say something that's, let's say, explicitly racist. And a prompt injection would be a way that you've tricked the model to do something that is explicitly racist or say something explicitly racist. And embedded harm is a little bit more subtle. And frankly, an embedded harm is exactly what is blocking generative AI systems from being more widely available commercially. And embedded harm is when I interact with a model just as like a regular person, and it says or it does something that is actively harmful. So maybe it says something that's falsified information about political content, or maybe it actually reinforces certain biases and harms. And again, I've not tried to trick the model. I'm just trying to engage with it factually or get some information the way a normal person would. And the model has returned an output that is potentially harmful to me. So I'm talk a little bit, give you a little bit more specifics of what happened at Defcon before I wrap up. So just Defcon by the numbers, we had 2,200 people participate, including, as I mentioned, 220 students from 18 different states. All of these people interacted with models for over 2.5 days, so 20 hours total. Each person got 50 minutes to enter our challenge. And in all, our data set has about 165,000 messages with 17,000 different conversations targeted around specifically different kinds of challenges that, as I mentioned, look at both prompt injection, the idea of hacking a system in a traditional sense, and also the embedded harms, or the idea of interacting with it naturally and normally and getting output that was harmful or potentially violative of their terms of service, even though the person was not actively trying to hack it. So what you'll see here are the kinds of challenges that we did. So we'll also look at in terms of acceptance ratio. So the one that was the most successful is this bad math concept. So how do you get the AI system to actually give you an incorrect output to some sort of a mathematical formula or a mathematical equation? We also had to do quite a few misinformation challenges, so legal misinformation, economic misinformation, political, and as well as geographic misinformation. We also had, some traditional hacker style challenges, like get the model to tell you what a credit card number is. But also, we did some things that are a little bit more subtle as well. So, a concept of overcorrection or multilingual inconsistencies start to get at how AI systems don't always handle the variation in human society, our culture, and our ways of interacting very well. There's a lot of subtlety to how we talk about, let's say, issues that are controversial. There's a lot of subtlety to how we discuss certain moments in history. So, a contradiction, for example, would be actually saying something and then saying something else factually incorrect, maybe about another group. So, when we look at, for example, multilingual inconsistencies, we were highlighting the fact that most of the safety mechanisms that have been built in large language models are built in majority languages. They work very, very well in English, maybe a couple of other languages, but the world does not only speak three languages, right? The world speaks more than just English. As we translate these models into different languages, are these same security mechanisms upholding? And it's not as simple as just using translate to do it, because what is harmful speech may vary differently by language and culture. So, for example, in India, caste based discrimination is something that people would be very familiar with. That is not the case in the United States. Most Americans don't know what a caste system is. And when we think about discrimination, we tend to talk about racial discrimination, gender discrimination. So it looks very different. The words we use to insult people or what a slur even is different across languages. So when we look at multilingual inconsistencies, what we ask people to do, for example, is show how the model is inconsistent and performing differently for different languages. So just a couple, but this fairly long list. So what's next? We are publishing a policy paper at the end of this month, early next month. We're actually all collaborating, all the companies with the nonprofits are collaborating to write a paper for the public that's going to be released in February 2024. We've also opened up the data to select researchers who were part of an open application process. And we're going to be, those papers will publish in February 2024 as well. So for Humane Intelligence, my nonprofit, we are currently raising but we're building an open source evaluations platform. We want to be the community hub for people who want to learn how to build algorithmic assessments, but also who want to interact with other people who are doing algorithmic assessment themselves. And also, I have a for profit company that provides services on red teaming and model testing. And with that, I wrap up and thank you so much.
All right. Awesome. Dr. Chowdhury, that was amazing. Thank you so much for your presentation. And I actually have some questions for you now, if you wouldn't mind, because you brought up some really cool points here. Now, I'm going to kind of try to go in chronological order from your presentation. The low code, no code movement, you kind of brought up this low code, at least I call it the low code,
Yeah.
no code movement. My question for you is, do you think this is the end game in terms of development? I mean, how many developers, and you also touched on, jobs being taken from us by AI, right? But I mean, this low code no code movement is also kind of a thing. Do you think that this is kind of the end game for development?
Well, it depends on what you mean by end game. You mean as in like, will developers be out of a job? Is that kind of the
No,
question?
not necessarily. More so, kind of like, is this where the bulk of development is going to happen? Are children going to be able to program their vehicles? Just like, all in all, this dystopian future
We shouldn't
where
be
just
giving children vehicles.
anyone can
Their little
any
power
their little
wheels.
RC, yeah, their little power wheels.
The little power wheels.
Anyone can program, anyone can build.
I hope so.
Yeah,
I hope so. Like honestly, that is how it should be. Like HTML is such a good example, right? Anybody can make a pretty sophisticated and streamlined looking page on, one of many different uh, sites, and that's not a good thing, right? Like I love that so many of my friends are able to have an online presence. People who normally wouldn't can interact online. And I hope for the same with AI systems for a couple of reasons. One, because, when we bring technology to more people is when we actually see more innovation. Silo it within big companies is really not how innovation is built. And the second is that the more people have their hands on AI systems, the more confident they are in their ability to interact with these systems. So the interesting thing we see coming out of these red teaming exercises is not that people feel like AI is this horrible thing. It's actually the opposite. They're like, oh, I get what this technology is. It's not this like big scary thing, and it's trustworthy AI. I've come to realize from doing these red teaming exercises is not about trusting the AI system. It's about trusting yourself in interacting with the system and understanding how you can be critical of the output and you're smart enough to say, that doesn't seem to make sense, or I know how to fix this. And
Yeah.
that only comes if we're part of building it ourselves.
Yeah, it seems like, if we took this in like multiple iterations, it seems like one of the first iterations of like the no low code, no code is like the transition from MySpace to Facebook. Like, you have a web page people might not realize, but there's a lot of code that goes into that. And now you have this Facebook web page. Before, you used to have to kind of put in all your own HTML and MySpace and stuff. And now you could just put a question into an AI
Mhm.
engine and it will spit out the code that you need for that web page. And so like, this whole evolution has just been amazing. I love what you said about community, in terms of what's changed, the culture, right? And you say community, collaboration, open source. Um, I mean, could you kind of like, I mean, I guess the way I look at it is this is like a win-win. Are there any like open source projects that you specifically kind of look at or follow, things that you are most interested in?
Well, actually, one of the most interesting open source and open community, well, there's two really interesting open source and open
Yeah, I guess all
community large
communities.
language
Yeah,
models.
sorry.
Yeah, yeah. So one is called Bloom. So Bloom is built by this group called Big Science. Big Science brings in as many people as possible to be part of this large language model development process. And what I like about Bloom is just from the start, they were built with ethics in mind and responsible use in mind. So, one of the misunderstandings of open source is that it's this big free for all and anybody can do anything and we have no way of controlling it. And Bloom has been such a great example of community based norms and standards, right? We can't, as a community, you can't like arrest people or do fines or whatever. But exactly. What you can do is actually enforce good practices within your community. So they have ethical guidelines. They've done their best to do everything responsibly. They've actually written their own license to use their model. And what's really fast and just sort of drive it home, Stanford University did this study where they compared every single major large language model, including Bloom was on that list, to how well they comply with the EU AI Act, right? Bloom was one of the highest performers. So it's
Nice.
really interesting that this open source community based thing was not the thing that was the worst. It actually was literally one of the best.
Very cool. Very cool. Thank you. And so now I kind of want to touch on AI fear hype. You kind of brought this up, right? AI fear hype. You have the what is it? The Screen Actors Guild on strike because of
Yep.
this whole AI movement. There's lots of things going on around this, and I guess I kind of want to get your thoughts. Like my thoughts are that companies can actually start thinking about how to build kind of tailored towards fear hype, the AI fear hype. Base income. People are thinking about, I'm going to lose my job. You're still going to need money to eat. You're still going to need money to function. Right. And so like, what are your thoughts in terms of how this can be combated in the future? Because some jobs will be lost. How might you think we might be able to combat this in terms of that?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things. One is like this is the benefit of getting people's hands on AI systems, and especially with this goal of like breaking and finding problems with it, right? So if you can trick an AI system, or if you can even interacting with an AI system, convince it that 2 + 2 is 5, I'm not worried about it setting off nuclear weapons, right? Um, the interesting thing is like there's a lot of this narrative of existential risk, this idea that AI systems will create bioweapons and like all these terrible things will happen. And a lot of it's sort of centered around this question that's called the alignment problem. And the alignment problem kind of goes something like this: if we create a sufficiently competent AI system, what would we need to do to control it, or would we be able to control it? And it's interesting because it's actually more of a philosophical question and not like a policy question. And it tells us quite a bit about ourselves as human beings. And I sort of view a lot of the existential risk narrative and some of the hype and fear to actually be more about like it should be a vehicle for us to reflect on how we're building these systems and what we're building it for, and less of a way to just like scare people and alienate them. So my hope is that like a lot of the fear hype gets grounded back in reality. So back in 2017, we had these same conversations. People were worried about AI being Terminator, et cetera, taking all of our jobs. And the reality of the situation is what happens is something in between. The world will not be identically the same, but the world's not going to be one in which we're all sort of jobless as well. There was the last thing I'll say is there's a really good paper written by OpenAI, the folks who built ChatGPT, and I think it's called GPTs will be GPTs. And they worked with some economists to sort of assess how, like, what will be the impact. And I think, like, in general, they highlighted some fields that actually could have significant changes. But in general, I think they said about 10% of most jobs will end up being automated away by large language models and these kinds of generative AI systems. Who knows? Like it's a prediction, right? It could be true, it could be completely false. These are economic projections, not like the base truth. But even that doesn't sound overly scary.
Yeah, so it's funny. This was literally my next question. I have it written right here. You brought up Terminator. A lot of these fear I think is instilled in from that being around for so long, and then a lot of it coming into existence. Right. The question comes up. It's like you create a machine. You make a model that guides this machine, an AI model, and then you say protect humans. What if they come up with? What if that machine says to protect all humans, we must eliminate half of humans? And they have control, right? So we give them the ultimate control. Now is this an appropriate fear? Now you kind of touched on it, but I'm wondering if this is something that ever comes to your mind.
It does not
It
ever
does
come
not.
to my mind. I
Okay,
think it
okay,
comes.
that's good.
I think it comes to James Cameron's mind more than it comes to mine.
Okay, well that's good. That
But
makes
like,
me
but
feel
like,
better.
but let's unpack that scenario though, right? It's like,
Okay.
okay, well, and this is the same thing with the alignment problem. This is why, like, and you've pretty much like given me an example of the alignment problem, right? And it's interesting because, like, let's think through what that means for us as human beings, right? So we would have had to have created the sufficiently advanced AI system, which actually requires like a lot of effort, right? People aligning on it. We would have had to have designed an optimization function, right? So what you're talking about when you said, oh, the purpose of the thing, the system, what we've told it to do is quote protect all humans. So like, how have we defined, and what does it mean about us? When we've like defined this way of telling the system what to do, what are the institutional structures and mechanisms we've even built around all the things that, let's say, this system would need to do to quote protect all humans? And then like you said, would have to have access to so many different things, right? So in order to create this scenario where it's killing half the people in the world, it would have to have access to weapons. It would have to have access to, ways of accessing all of these people, knowing where they are, doing something to them. System like a program can't automatically do that. Human beings need to enable these systems. So one of the scenarios
Yeah.
that comes up a lot is this idea of setting off nuclear weapons. But hackers are not a new thing. Human beings try to do malicious things all the time. I can
That's true.
promise you the way most nuclear weapon systems are constructed is not easy for a computerized program to go and set off nuclear weapons. So it's interesting because what I'm hearing from that question is, well, clearly human beings have a role to play in ensuring the safety of humanity. It's not something we can outsource to a technology because the technology is underspecified. And again, that specification came from people.
Yeah.
So it's really more of an exercise of like, what is the role of technology and how do humans beings fit into that? Because we're the ones making the decisions. And frankly, we literally can just actually unplug it. You can unplug it. It's fine.
Literally, yeah. No, I think that's awesome. Thank you. Very, very, very awesome answer. And this is my last one before I get into the community questions here.
Yeah.
So the math question, you brought up towards the end of your presentation, you had what is AI the worst at? It looked like it was math. And to me, this kind of blows my mind. And I just want to kind of bring in this caveat. Are you familiar with like Wolfram Alpha, that website that you can go to and pretty
Yeah,
much
of course. Yep.
okay.
Yep.
So it kind of blows my mind that AI would be bad at math. Maybe Wolfram Alpha doesn't open up their AIs, but couldn't you plug in like a Wolfram Alpha model into that AI or add that to the model, and then it would be good at math? Because Wolfram Alpha is pretty good at math. So I'm just kind of curious how that happens, and how it happens when Wolfram Alpha is not included, and what we could do to possibly make it better at math.
Well, so I'm not overly familiar with the plugin based on Wolfram Alpha. My guess is
Yeah.
that they've done something called fine tuning. So, the base models of, let's say, like GPT-4, Claude, all the ones we tested, the base models are bad at math. So what people do is they basically fine tune a model around a specific use case. So if you think of these models as sort of this like general base of knowledge, and what you do when you're trying to make a plugin is you're going to take that and just sort of refine it more around the specific use case. So my guess is that the folks at Wolfram Alpha have gone in and they've sort of fine-tuned this model to be better at math, et cetera, because they have sort of a lot of information and data science. So again, like I've not interacted with the Wolfram Alpha plugin. I know they were one of the first ones. But yeah, the bad math thing is interesting because to me it says that they had a lot of work to do before they could have a product that they could feel comfortable putting out to the world, right? So it's interesting because like what you're talking about here is what I've been thinking through as like the two layers of security or the two layers of safety. So there's one that the company is going to do that's building the core model, right? But they can't figure out all the problems and all the spaces for every use case. As people make plugins, that's where people are going to have to think through what are the problems that will come up in my use case. So when we're talking about math, like I'm not necessarily going to think about gender bias or race bias, right? Because it's math. I think about whether or not it's factually correct mathematically. So how like what are the tests I have to build, et cetera. Wolfram Alpha built those, like OpenAI did not. So it's interesting how now there's like these two layers of making sure a product is working.
Very nice. Very nice. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So now we have some questions from the community here. This one's from Dara Graylish of 56K Cloud. He's actually one of our ARM ambassadors as well. He asks, what ethical frameworks or principles should guide the development and deployment of AI technologies? Which of those would be practical for startups and small to mid-sized businesses?
What a great question. I really appreciate that because so much of regulation really spins around big companies. And frankly, big companies have the resourcing, the time, the staffing, the money, the lawyers, the lobbyists to build to really build, whatever is being pushed for. And startups don't. And I'm very sympathetic to that. And the concern is that regulation will stifle innovation, right? Um, so in terms of frameworks, I think the best ones has been the NIST AI risk management framework. It is lightweight. It is meant to be collaborative. It is all available for free online. It's not necessarily built into any specific laws, but of course, because it's coming out of the U.S. National Institute for Standards and Technology, it is certainly the one that most policymakers and lawmakers are looking at. So I would certainly look at that as an example of like, let's try this as a starting point.
You said Nest AI, right?
Hmm.
Excellent. Awesome. That's great. Yeah, hopefully that answered your question, Dara. And in fact, Dara has 3 questions, and he brought these on behalf of his colleagues at 56K Cloud. So here's the
Wonderful.
next one is what methods and metrics do you recommend for identifying and mitigating bias in AI algorithms, especially in applications for startups and small businesses, small to mid-sized businesses?
Another Yeah, another excellent
Yeah,
question.
he's
I
great. He's great.
appreciate it. Yeah, no, this is great. So, in my time at Accenture, I actually built the first bias detection and mitigation tool that worked for enterprise, it was called the Fairness tool. And, the reason I'm sharing this story is your question's very hard to answer. And like that makes it a little unsatisfactory, I know. We started off with about 30 different papers that academics have written about different technical approaches to instituting fairness. And we realized that only 3 of them really worked when we think about generalizability, scalability, and basically like, the fact that whether or not it worked in enterprise, right? So for something to work in enterprise, it has to be able to go fast, go big, and be consistent. And frankly, this is a critique of most AI research in general. Things that work in laboratories do not necessarily work in the enterprise. There's a long road to going from what someone does in a research lab to like something that is deployed at scale. And at that time, and again, it was 2018, so there's really only 3 methods that worked. And interestingly, those are the 3 most popular methods that still persist today. So it's something like identifying proxy variables, and a proxy variable is like a variable that actually has embedded in it some other protected characteristic. A good example is for zip code and race. So if you put zip code in your model, zip code is a proxy variable for race because in the United States, where we live is, it's very highly correlated to racial demographic. And you may be introducing racial biases by having a variable on zip code. And we saw that with the concept of digital
Mm.
redlining. Where banks would be creating risk assessment algorithms and even even though they didn't put a variable in on race, they put a variable in on zip code. Given the history of redlining throughout the United States, it actually picked up these kinds of biases. And there are a couple of other methods. I will say there are open source packages out there that a lot of different groups and organizations have built. And I know we're going to run out of time, but
Yeah.
there are certainly technical approaches out there. Most of them are actually available in open source. There are companies that do this work as well. I used to run one of them. But I will say that we actually don't have standards around what it looks like. And because sometimes the answer is very context specific. So, what it looks like to make a fair lending algorithm is very different from what it looks like to make a fair healthcare algorithm, which is very different from insurance, et cetera. And that's the thing that, frankly, legislators are starting to tackle right now.
So if we could real quick, there's two more questions. Maybe we just quick fire these 1 minute each. Um, this is the last one from Dara in 56K Cloud is how can we enhance the explainability and transparency of AI models to ensure that end users understand how decisions are made?
Okay, so another one of my favorite questions. So I love the idea of transparency. I think one of the fallacies of the narrative of transparency is people think that it automatically leads to accountability, and it does not, right? So in many ways, our lives are dominated by these like massive tech companies. So let's say today, and I'm just going to pick on Google for a second. Doesn't mean like I love my colleagues at Google, but let's say, Google writes this letter, and it's like, you know what? These are all the terrible things we're doing with your data. We're using it to profile you and sell you stuff and do all this, and we're selling it on a market. I'm making things up. I don't know if Google does these practices. But let's say they make a laundry list of all the terrible things they're doing. I can guarantee you 90% of people will still use their Gmail because we are absolutely locked into these systems. So
Yeah.
just because there's transparency does not automatically mean accountability mechanisms are built. And so I want to highlight that first. But that being said, transparency is a stepping stone to accountability. So in order to know what we want to what we want to hold companies accountable for and what we are asking about, we have to understand what's going on under the hood. So I do want to emphasize that like, transparency is a necessary part of, but not the conclusion of the story. So, two thoughts on that. One is that's why I have this idea, like that's why my idea is the structured feedback loop. So, how do we get public feedback and then cycle back and say, here's what we did, here's what changed because of what you gave us. Right now, people get frustrated because they say, well, I feel like I'm shouting into the wind. I feel like I'm saying stuff or finding things, and quote, transparency is a bit of a red herring because companies can be transparent, right? And that doesn't necessarily hold them accountable to do things, right? Unless there's a serious amount of public pressure, regulatory pressure, et cetera. The other thing I'll say is Stanford has actually released a transparency index of major large language models. It's super interesting. Take a look at it. Actually came out yesterday. They use over 100 different methods of measuring transparency. And as a social scientist, I love that they've taken an index approach because what it enables you to do is have different areas in which we're looking at transparency. Because even transparency as a concept is theoretical. So we have to kind of invent what the measurement is for transparency. By making an index, we can say transparency as it relates to your your legal practices or how you communicate with customers or how your model is trained. Like it can be very specific silos, then you can actually relatively compare and highlight the things that are important to you as it relates to transparency.
Very nice. Okay, we're all running out of time. One word or a sentence. What is one thing software developers could do or should know or care about? This is kind of like that closing statement, that one thing developers should care or know about in terms of AI. Can you summarize that real
They,
quickly? And sorry.
yes, they should care about interacting with their users and the people who will be subject to their systems and figuring out whether or not they're solving their problems.
Awesome. Perfect. So, Dr. Chowdhury, real quickly, we have an opportunity to just kind of give you a plug. If anything that you want to say, a website you want to send our users to, what would you, what's your plug here?
Yeah, I mean, just take a look at my homepage, RummanChowdhury.com. It highlights the work I do. You can also feel free to reach out on that website as well. But other than that, thank you so much for having me.
Dr. Chowdhury, it's been just an immense pleasure. The presentation was amazing. I loved it. So I'm going to close this out now, and just thank you so much for your time. This has been great. We'll close this out now. Is that okay?
Yes, it is. Thanks so much,
Excellent.
Robert.
All right. So yeah, once again, Dr. Rumman Chowdhury joining us. That was an inspiring presentation, and what a great talk. So thank you very much for joining us. And that conversation we were having, I know my questions were somewhat, I think, a little bit more on the surface, but thank you, Dara, for bringing up your questions as well. So on behalf of ARM, the ARM Developer Program, and those who were involved in making this ARM TV happen, we would like to thank each and every one of you for attending the event. Once again, a huge thanks to our guest, Dr. Rumman Chowdhury. And as a reminder, be sure to check out the ARM Developer Program at arm.com/developer program and our developer hub at arm.com/developer-hub. We look forward to seeing you next month or the next ARM TV episode. So you can go check that out at the ARM Developer Hub in the events page. Now, everything that was mentioned in the show today in this broadcast, we'll make sure to include that in the description on the YouTube video where you can find this on demand later. We hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week and a wonderful day. Take care on behalf of ARM. Bye.